recording so we can put this onto the web for the folks who aren't able to make it. Thank you for being here today. This is session 3 of this cycle's Community Building Institute, and we are excited to have Shannon Stober with us. Shannon, you probably saw from her bio, or maybe you remember her if you're a National Service member in Montana from the Serve Symposium in Helena a month ago or so. Is a kind of National Service superstar, an alum, and does all kinds of training with folks who do national service in Montana and with the nonprofit sector and education as well. So we're very excited to have her with us today to talk about this critical part of community building, putting together community advisory groups. So I won't steal any more of your thunder, Shannon. Hand it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. So much thunder stolen. So good morning or afternoon. I know we've got some folks in a different time zone. Happy to be here. Happy to see you. Yes, we are doing the Community Building Institute, and this is session 3. So let's see if we can get my tab to go over. We did. So a little bit about me. I know quite a few of you are already familiar, but for folks who haven't had the opportunity to work with me, I am in fact a bit of a national service junkie. So I enrolled in AmeriCorps Vista in 2002, came up to Bozeman, Montana, where I worked at a youth center, went on to do a second term of service as a Vista leader with the Prevention Resource Center in Helena. After I completed that term of service, I worked with the Governor's Office of Community Service, where actually did a lot of work with the Community Building Institute and kind of got my chops training and writing curriculum for national service members. After that experience, I hopped over to the Montana Campus Compact, worked there for a good bit, enjoyed it very much. And then I came back over to Bozeman, Montana, where I served as the Director of Programs with the Montana Conservation Corps for about 8 years. I now own my own company. It's called Verve Exchange Consulting. And as Josh mentioned, I do a lot of training, workshopping, and coaching, work with all the national service programs in Montana, as well as working with some programs nationally. And I am also the chair of the Montana AmeriCorps alum. So yes, that's a little bit about me. Clearly, I am a service junkie. So I wanted to start by just pitching and letting you guys know, like, the community building life cycle is the truth, right? Like this model, if you choose to use this as a tool during your term of service, or really at any point as you're operating as a public servant, working with a nonprofit and trying to do good things in communities, you will get benefit from it. I remember when I was at Vista, I always tell people that one of the crowning achievements of my Vista year was closing a youth center. And people always react to that like, what? That's crazy. Like, that's not what Vista should be doing. But the reality is that, you know, when I came into my site, they were heavy into implementation. The things that we were trying to do weren't working. And it wasn't until I stepped back and thought about the community life cycle did I realize, gosh, we need to go back and reassess and see if we're aligned with the community need. And we weren't. And so just using this as a tool allowed me to kind of rethink what the organization was doing with its budget for young people in Bozeman, and develop a new strategy to better meet the needs of that emerging population. So I just want to say that, you know, this is a really strong model. I use it all the time in my work. And so just an extra plug in case you weren't bought in just enough to that model. So today we are going to be talking about community advisory groups. That's step 3. So the idea is that with the community building life cycle, you'll come in, you'll make sure that you clearly understand the need in your community, that you've assessed that fully, and that you've done an adequate job of raising awareness to others about that need. So again, this is about step 3, but before we jump into outcomes, I just want to say that many of you may have a community advisory group that's already in operation or that you're already working with, and you're going, gosh, I don't know if we've done the assessment, or maybe it seems out of sequence. And I just want to assure you that even if that's the case, like, that's okay. Very few organizations come out and map this cycle in a linear order. So just remember, it's a tool for you to go back and ensure that you've taken care of the things that you need to take care of. So even though it's step 3 and you might feel like, gosh, I have some work to do on step 1, that is okay. We're building the plane as we fly it, so to speak. So what am I hoping that we can accomplish today? I want to give you an opportunity to explore the importance of advisory groups, of working with community advisory groups for your project or your initiative. We'll take a little bit of time to define and characterize some various group models that you might see or that you might be interacting with. And then we're going to really deep dive into what are those common pitfalls, right? Like, how do these things go poorly, and use that as a way to identify best practices in working with community advisory groups. If time allows at the end, we'll also create some space to talk about tips specifically for national service members, since I know so many of you out there today are serving, and just kind of thinking about the role that working with community advisory groups plays in national service. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish with all of you guys today. Now, I know that webinars can be a little bit tricky, and that we all wish and desire that there was a little bit more two-way conversation. So just to kind of set the stage for that, I've included several chat questions for us this afternoon. We've also generated several polls. We'll give the polls a shot and see how that works. As we're going through the content, if you have questions, save those, because we will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. It can be hard when you're delivering a webinar if somebody gets a chat question that you want answered right then to catch it. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and if I do see it and can answer it while we're in the presentation, I will. And if not, we'll do that at the end of the call. And at the end of the call, we could get crazy. You could unmute yourselves and we could actually talk. So be prepared for maybe getting nuts and unmuting yourselves by the end of the webinar. Okay. I always like to know what the presenter has done that makes them an authority on a subject. So I just want to give you a little street cred from me real quick. So what we have in front of us is just a sampling of some of the work that I've done serving on community advisory councils. So I currently serve on the Reach Higher Montana Advisory Council. When the Big Sky Watershed Corps was in its when it was being conceptualized in its first couple of years, I served on that steering committee. And then you'll see a variety of other opportunities to engage as a community advisor. In addition to that, I've also staffed and supported various advisory committees. And so I feel like I have a good sense of what that looks like on both ends. So like I said, street cred goes a long way. Always nice to know that the person coming at you with information has a little bit of experience in the field. All right. So before we get going, I want you to test your chat feature with the following riddle. So the riddle on the screen says, throw away the outside and cook the inside, then eat the outside and throw away the inside. What is it? So this is your opportunity to test your chat capability. So go ahead and take a guess and put your answer in the chat box. So throw away the outside and cook the inside, then eat the outside and throw away the inside. What is it? Somebody take a guess. Squash. Okay, we have squash. An ear of corn. All right, what else might it be? Squash, corn. We're very veggie minded today. Squash or corn. Let's see if we can get one more or two more guesses. Randy Meyer says corn. We've got a smiling corn. We have enthusiastic corn and smiling corns. Get a few more out there. Again, this is us testing your chat, so want to make sure your chat's working. If you have no clue, feel free to write that. Thank you. It's like we were on the same page there, Kiara. Keep going. Let's get a few more. Corn sounds good. Adam is stumped. Corn sounds good. Who else? Any other guesses? We have squash. We have quite a few votes for corn. We have absolutely clueless. Okay. Very good. Well, you're all very bright because it's corn. Corn is, in fact, the correct answer. Thank you for those of you. I know, Caitlin, what are you going to do? Thanks for those of you who chose to participate in this morning's fun riddle. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. So what is a community advisory group? This is one of those content areas where you're going to hear a lot of terminology, a lot of different names, and people are going to use those names interchangeably, right? So there's not like a one hard and fast rule for how these things are spoken about. But speaking totally generally, community members are pulled together to advise your organization or your initiative by looking at the problem that you've identified, coming up with ideas about what can be done with it, and then creating in helping implement an action plan, right? So if you look at that community building life cycle, you'll see that really your community advisory group is the entity that you're going to work through that entire process with, right? You're going to utilize them every step of the way. So what's the value of this, right? Why is it important that we bring this into our work? Well, first of all, when we're operating alongside with community members, they're going to provide us with invaluable guidance and insight, right? So we have to recognize, especially as national service members, that we're really just visitors to these communities, and we're really just visitors to these issues and initiatives we're working on. And so it's important that we're getting that guidance and insight from the community, right? So they're really kind of our guides for what we're doing. And these are the folks that not only are assisting us with long-term visioning, right? So we've identified this problem. We have a high rate of teen pregnancy, and our vision is sort of to get young women into adulthood where they can make choices about what direction they want to go. So they're going to help us do that vision. But the advisory group is also the people that are going to help us kind of take that step by step and help us with day-to-day and special projects and initiatives. So they really are serving both ends of that spectrum for us. The most important piece, especially for those of you out there who are serving as VISTAs, who are charged with creating capacity and sustainability, is that when we're working closely with a community advisory group, this is how we generate true sustainability. I think a lot of times when we talk about sustainability, we lens that out in a strictly fiscal sense, and we sort of neglect to think about the fact that true sustainability is when we have full citizen power and community ownership over the work. So we're not going to get too far into this, but I did want to share this model with you. So this is a model, I think that came, oh, it's right there, 1969. This is kind of a community organizing model that's been used in a lot of different theories for a lot of different powerful movements that talks about how do we create citizen control of an initiative. So if you look at the bottom couple rungs of this ladder, they call it therapy and manipulation. Again, we're using some outdated language. But essentially what we're talking about there is when we approach members of the community strictly as beneficiaries, right? They don't have anything to offer. They don't have any leadership to extend. They don't have insight to share. They're strictly receiving a benefit from our initiative. When we get up to that next couple rungs on the ladder, we start looking at informing, which means we're telling people what we're doing. We're telling them why we're doing it, and consulting. So now instead of just that one-way communication, we're actually engaging in a two-way communication, okay? Once we get up to that part, now we can start moving to true citizen control, which is where we've consulted, we've informed, and these folks now have the information they need to guide the effort, to take leadership, to take accountability. So when we're talking about creating sustainability by working with community advisory groups, we're not just talking about informing your work, we're talking about creating a container to create citizen power moving forward. So I just want folks to remember that. And if you're interested in this, again, this is called the ladder of participation, and it's pretty commonly used. And if you're not familiar with it, you might want to give that one a Google. Okay, so we're going to do a poll. So this is how it's going to go. Josh is going to put them up, but all of my polls are coming up in one thing. So this is just question one that Josh is going to pop up here in a second. But looking at these titles, which of these is not an advisory group? So we have a steering committee, an advisory council, a board of directors, a coordinating council, or a task force. Which of those is not an advisory group? So go ahead and click the box, and then something's going to happen magically with Zoom. And then Josh is going to report out to us. Josh will let us know what comes up. Is it working?
So far, I'm seeing 0 of 14 votes.
Woo, killing it, guys.
Chat.
Oh, I think we can't submit just one answer. It isn't working. Cool. Let's go ahead and just throw this on chat. So for those of you, and we'll no worries on that. So let's just go ahead and put it in the chat box. Which of those up there is not an advisory group? A steering committee, an advisory council, a board of directors, or a coordinating council, or a task force? So I'm seeing a couple votes for task force, board of directors, BOD, task force, coordinating council. Okay. So it seems like the majority of the votes are for task force or board of directors, with one person throwing out maybe a coordinating council. Well, turns out, trick question. All of these actually can represent a community, the ones that don't advise. Sam, you win. You're done. Certificate provided. Here's your award. Actually, all of these entities can, in certain ways, show up in an advisory capacity, right? And I wanted to introduce this to you because these are the different languages that you're going to hear. And all of these things are an indicator that you may be working with a community advisory group. So a board of directors is sometimes a little bit different, right? So board of directors would be the most empowered entity that we have on this list, right? So these are the folks that are in charge of your agency budget, hiring, firing of your executive director, and have what we commonly refer to as the fiduciary responsibility of the organization. Now in smaller organizations, smaller nonprofits, it's really common to see your board of directors also operating as sort of doers and advisors. Larger nonprofits, sometimes it's a bit more formalized, but that's that. Steering committees, so steering committees oftentimes are where you're seeing new entities come together in partnership to design a new program, and maybe that program doesn't have staffing yet or just has an entry-level staffer, and so they're operating as an advisory entity to that person in the community they're working with, and often are communicating with the board of directors. Coordinating council, so again, this is oftentimes where we're seeing different providers coming together. So for example, if you're working on youth issues, maybe you're serving on a coordinating council or a watershed coordinating council, where we're bringing all these people to the table to help identify priorities and advise efforts of individuals. Advisory councils tend to be a smaller group of people that are advising up to leadership. So I mentioned that I'm on the Reach Higher Montana Advisory Council. So we come together, they pepper us with questions, we give them a bunch of information, and they distill that and figure out how to make meaning of that and bring it into their programs. And task forces are usually sort of a set amount of time, short-term group that's coming together to address a specific issue or do a certain project. So that's just an example of the kind of language that you may see, or the different models if you are charged with working with some kind of a community group or creating one, some different models you want to look at. Board of directors is probably not the case for most of you, but these others are real applicable. So the thing I want to mention before we move forward, folks, is that all of these entities are volunteer-based. So when we're looking at our community advisory groups, none of these people are paid. So what that means is that we have to bring all of our knowledge around volunteer management and volunteer recognition into our practices with our community advisory groups. It can be really hard to remember that because oftentimes these folks are empowered and sometimes they're giving us feedback or they're directing our efforts. And so we tend to get frustrated with them the same way we would staff. But we have to remember that they're volunteers. We're not going to be able to deep dive into volunteer management practices today, but I did just want to offer, I'm doing volunteer management workshops for the Montana Nonprofit Association in May. So if you're interested in learning more about volunteer management, and if that's something that you're doing quite a bit of during your service, I would say check out that workshop, see if there's one that you can attend, and we'll cover it more there. Okay. So what's happening with you, right? So I want to get a sense of what your work plans look like and who we've got out there and what your role is with community groups. This will be a little trickier because we're not going to be able to do the poll, I don't think, but that's okay. So what I'm looking for is, and let's just go ahead and just put this at A, B, and C to deal with our polling issue. Number one, A means you are working with a community advisory group, you are serving with a community advisory group. That's option A. Option B is that part of your role in service is to create an advisory group, okay? So B means you're creating a group. And then let's say C is any of the ones below that. I'm working on a needs assessment, I'm working on outreach activities, I'm working with volunteers, and if none of those apply, just hit none. So A, I'm serving with a group. B, I'm creating a group. C, one of these other things. D, none of these things. I'm doing nothing. Okay, so we've got quite a few of you who are working with needs assessments and outreach activities and volunteers. B, we have somebody who is charged with creating one. C, D, E, got it, cool, let's keep going. What else do we have? D and E, awesome. Who else? 4 people here. Hi, Richland County. A, B, C, and D. Yes. D and E. All right. Cool. Anybody else out there? Is there any, woo, got crazy. Is there anybody out there that is not doing any of these things, who feels like none of the things that have been listed applies to them? You're not serving a group, creating a group. You're not doing the needs assessment, outreach, volunteers. Okay. A little bit tougher when we don't have a poll, but thank you for those of you who jumped in. So I wanted to bring this up because not all of you are serving a group directly or have to create one, but I just want to assure you, as we jump into the content and the meat of this, that all of the things that we cover are going to be applicable. So if you're doing a needs assessment, you're going to need these skills. If you're doing outreach, you're going to need these skills. And if you're doing volunteer. And then, yeah, Sam, and you are working with volunteers. Yes. So much of what we cover is going to be really applicable to all of those different service activities. So I just wanted to make sure that you recognize that as we begin, and are looking closely and not necessarily being like, but I'm not doing advisory group. Just look for the relevant information. It's all in there. Okay. This is the fun one. So when we're talking about advisory groups, we're inherently talking about working with teams of people. So let's start with how that goes poorly, because I think we've all experienced that. So again, chat question, and I'm looking for a lot of information on this one. In your experience, what contributes to the failure of a group trying to work together? What are the common pitfalls? Communication, loud and proud, different goals, lack of communication. What else? We've all had it. What makes working together easier without you? What are the pitfalls? Refusing to contribute, yeah. I don't know, excuse me, personal agendas, yes. Clashing strong personalities, okay. Keep going, what else? People being too attached to their ideas, that's huge. Too many bosses, that is one of my favorites. Nothing makes me run more than that. Misunderstanding the problem, great. Lack of organization and task distribution, yep. What else? What makes working together that much harder? We've got communication, personalities, lack of information and organization, people being attached. What else contributes to making that work harder? Let's get a couple more answers from you guys. Money, the abundance of it, I'm sure is what you mean. Yeah, resources. Yeah, absolutely. Scheduling is huge. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's a big one. What else? Lack of a common goal. Get a couple more. Different expectations and outcomes and goals. Yep. Keep going. Let's get one or two. Let's get two more examples. Different expectations, outcomes, and goals again. Diverse backgrounds. I think we've got the next poll figured out. Oh, thanks, Josh. I'm reading that one aloud. A huge problem with my org is physical distance to get together. Okay, awesome. You guys know this stuff, right? It's really, really easy for us to sit and name all of the different things that make that experience problematic. So let's jump to this next one and get another poll out there. Oh, wait, there it is. Hold on. I got to go back this way. Oh, no, hold on. You all saw it. Okay, well, Josh, I'm glad you got the poll, but I messed up the slides. So that poll is no longer, I just gave you the answer. That's fine.
I just want to say that professionalism is what makes the Montana Campus Compact Community Building Institute really what it is. It's
stellar. That's your webinars, man. Webinars are always a little bit unpredictable. So the question I was going to ask you, and feel free to answer it, right? There's a little bit of a giveaway behind it, but which of these that are listed on the screen will cause the most dysfunction with your advisory group? So the options are poor structure, poor group dynamics, interpersonal issues, or individual member issues. So which of those 4 things do you think has the largest impact on creating dysfunction within your team environment, within your advisory committee? Josh, are you getting votes?
We are. Yeah, we're doing well.
Okay.
Seems like folks, 12 of 14 have voted. A couple folks still considering this. So I'm gonna shut down the poll here. We just have a 15th person jump on. Looks like right now we've got 10 folks voting for poor structure, 7 voting for poor group dynamics. Ooh, that just jumped up to 8.
Whoa!
4 for interpersonal and 4 also for individual issues.
Okay, cool. So you guys see this on the screen, right? And what we have here, this is called the waterline model, and it's a model that was generated in the late 70s. Again, I love 70s research. Apparently all my models come from that era. But it was created by a group of researchers who were trying to identify the root causes for task disruption, just simply meaning things aren't getting done, and conflict and disharmony in teams that were working together. And what they identified were these 4 categories which generate task disruption and conflict. So structure, group dynamics, interpersonal issues, and intrapersonal issues. What was really interesting about this research was they found that 80% of the time, task disruption or conflict was due to poor structure or poor group dynamics, but more than 80% of the time, the individuals that were experiencing those things were attributing it to an interpersonal issue or an intrapersonal one-person issue. So this is really, really good information to know, right? This is a strong tool anytime you're working with groups, but really something to bring to bear when you're thinking about your advisory committee or the entity that you're working with or any team you're working with. Oftentimes, when we see task disruption and conflict, it's because of poor structure and poor dynamics. So we are going to use that model as a way to identify some best practices in working with our advisory groups. Maybe. Come on. You can click. Yes, here we go. So let's start with structure. So the first piece around structure that you're going to want to make sure that you've addressed in working with any group, but your community group in particular, is identifying a clear purpose, right? Identifying a clear purpose. One thing that I like to tell people, if you cannot clearly articulate the purpose for your group, then you do not need one, right? Don't pull together a group simply because it's on the chart of CBI. You need to do it because you recognize what you want them to do. Is this a steering committee? Is this an advisory group? Are we looking for a coordinating council? So you need to clearly understand what the purpose is and make sure that you can attach that to your mission statement and the vision of your organization. Then you select your structure and name, right? So start there, right? Like, so it's like, okay, we have this purpose is attached to our mission and vision. And so now we're going to identify what kind of structure we want to fall into, and we're going to name that. And then you begin with drafting a plan with clear goals. So we noticed that as one of the things that comes up is we have mismatched goals or we're not clear on that. So this is where you start with those goals, right? Start thinking about those outcomes, but you want to do so in such a way that when your advisors come on board, they have the ability to personalize those. So for example, you might say, you know, we have a goal of reducing childhood hunger in our community by 20%, and we want to see that incrementally over this number of years. So now you have a clear goal, and now your advisors can come in and sort of begin to think about how to strategize that and create outcomes around it. So hopefully that makes sense, but first structure piece is always starting with purpose, making sure you can clearly articulate why you need advisors, why you need them in a committee structure, identifying the structure you're using along with the timeline, and then starting to rough out those goals. Okay, so then the next piece with structure is starting with your roles and responsibilities, right? So again, we can have the name, we can know why this entity exists, and we can have a rough sense of our goals. But we also want to make sure that individual advisors recognize and understand what their purpose is. So I always start with member position descriptions, right? So if you are working with a committee or a group, provide those people with a position description and put as much work into that as you would a position description for a staff member you were hiring. So this is where you want to include summary statements that articulate the purpose, knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? What the ideal candidate is looking like. You're going to say, here are the key functions. So you'll be making decisions. You'll be participating in quarterly meetings. We'll expect that you volunteer 10 hours a year. Whatever it is, but you need to line that out as clearly as you possibly can. It got mentioned, but one of the things that's really frustrating about working with advisory groups is sometimes people don't follow through, right? Or they're not carrying their weight. So we start to tone set that here by giving them position descriptions and something to hold them accountable to. And it's not just about that. It's also about helping them understand that role so they know what they need to do. The next piece, so if you have a position description, then the next piece is to actually give people resources so that they can meet those requests. So for example, if you're like, well, we want you to do decision making, or we want you to help us figure out this issue with early childhood education, then you need to be providing them with resources, research materials, best practices that they can review. You may have to provide them with information on how to serve on an advisory committee, anything you can do to support their performance to meet the objectives that you've put forth in the position description. And then finally, develop that draft calendar and timelines, right? So this is something that a lot of times we bring people together and we try and co-create with them. And it's important, obviously, that we're meeting other people's needs and that we are making sure that we're accommodating them the best we can. But I personally find if I say, hey, I'm recruiting for an advisory committee, here's the draft calendar, we meet 5 times a year, once each of these months, and this is the timeline that we're trying to get work done under. That level of structure helps people kind of opt in or opt out if it doesn't work for them. And again, gives me a tool to help manage that group from a really neutral place because our expectations are clear. So we got purpose and we got roles and responsibilities. The next piece with structure is to be thinking about staffing, right? And this is another area that I see nonprofits kind of fumble the ball a good amount. Staff roles in regards to your community entity should be super clear, right? And folks will forget to do this. They'll say, oh, well, just call Judy or whoever answers the phone, or we're all kind of working on it. And the problem is again, that's lack of structure, and that's going to create some task disruption and potentially conflict because folks aren't clear. And this is where we also can see our egos start to play and dance together a little bit. So I always like to say that key support staff should be clearly identified. If I'm joining an advisory council or an advisory committee, I need to know who my point person is, right? And then I also need to know that might be my point person, but what happens if the ED reaches out? Am I now going around that point person? What happens if the board reaches out? Because sometimes things like that are going to happen. So you want to make sure that the key person is identified and that the chain of command is identified and that you know how people are communicating with one another. If you are the key support staff that has been identified, or if you're designing one of these systems for your organization, the next thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you are allocating a little bit of time every week to support that advisory entity. So again, another mistake I see people do is only communicate right before a meeting, right? Or only communicate when they need something. And that's a big miss, right? Because anytime that we're trying to keep a group engaged in working with us long term, we want to do our best to be interacting with them periodically. So key support staff should say, I've got an hour or two each week that I always pick up the work with the advisory committee and see what I can do to move it forward and make sure folks have what they need. And then finally, and I touched on it a little bit, and this is tough, especially for service members, but it's really important that staff and board members are respecting each other's roles in regards to the group. Right? So this is where you might have to manage up sometimes, or you might have to give some insight and feedback if you're watching leadership not navigate that dance very well and step on each other's feet. It can be really frustrating as an advisory committee member to not know who you answer to and to have people of different levels of power coming in and communicating differently. So that's something internally you want to watch for. Is again, we've got clear staff roles. We know who our support staff is. They've got the margin to do some work with this entity as often as possible, and leadership is respecting the boundaries. Staffing. Okay. Next is orientation, right? So we've talked about purpose, roles and responsibilities, and staffing. Orientation is critical, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, but I can think of a lot of different times that I've been invited to a new committee or a new community of people, and I walk in the room and nobody really orients me, nobody tells me what's going on, and nobody's really even introducing me to others. And that stuff really matters, right? And this is where this absolutely is structural. So when we're talking about orientation and properly onboarding people to a new team, what we're really talking about is increasing their competency and their confidence. And that comes directly from the field of situational leadership. So again, if that's not something you're familiar with, I would encourage you to check it out because it gives us a lot of good cues on how we sort of take a volunteer community member in and take them from an enthusiastic beginner all the way to being a peak performer. but orientation is one of the key components of that. So you want to make sure that you're properly orienting your new members. And that includes everything we've just covered, an overview of the mission, vision, and purpose. Give that information right out of the gate. Show them the roles and responsibilities. Here's your position description. Here's the resources. Here's the calendar, right? Give them all that. And then do that introduction and team building piece, right? Again, remember that these are volunteers. And volunteers very rarely volunteer strictly for a cause. Oftentimes people who volunteer are also looking for an opportunity to learn a new skill or meet another need, the need to belong in specific. And so it's important that you give them an opportunity to feel like they belong and that the group is taking them in when they begin. So make sure you're bringing those team building activities into your orientation. Final piece is accountability, right? So none of this works, and accountability is absolutely part of structure. None of it works without the structure, and structure doesn't work without accountability to the structure. So for me, this can be a little tough because these are volunteers and we have a tendency to want to be very forgiving with them and give them a lot of space, and they're just volunteers. I don't want to, I don't want to bother them. But the reality is, when we accept a responsibility, when we take that position description and say, I'm willing to do this, then we have to be held accountable to our commitment. And when we don't hold people accountable to those commitments, we've all seen what it can do. You can have one person on your committee that's not following through and you're not holding them accountable, and it's going to tank the entire effort. So it's really important that you hold people accountable. Some tips around that. Number one, create clear participation expectations. So again, that's your position description. Those are your resources. That's your calendar and timeline. There should be no question as to what adequate participation on your group looks like. Next, create clear communication expectations, right? And this is something that might be personal, but you need to dialogue around it, right? When do we communicate? When do I need to hear back from you? What does that look like? Be explicit about that up front, so that you guys can meet each other's needs before it becomes a difficult conversation. Name the consequences up front, right? So it's like, we expect that people that are serving on this steering committee will make every meeting. If you miss more than 2 in a year, then we're going to ask you to identify somebody else who can do that. So again, that's all about being neutral. So instead of having to have a difficult conversation when somebody's not performing how you want them to perform, you're simply saying, hey, these are the agreements we made. It doesn't seem like it's working for you. What do you think, right? Nip inappropriate behavior quickly. Right? So when you start to see things digress, when people are maybe coming in late, or they're not coming in prepared, or they seem to all of a sudden be operating in a communication vacuum and you're not hearing from them, jump on that quick, right? The more that we allow that to just build and roll, the harder it is. And again, recognizing that when we allow those behaviors that aren't working for the group to get too big, it actually can become toxic for the entire team. So don't be afraid to move quickly when you see people not following through, and name that kindly and ask questions, but do address it. And then finally, follow the rules yourself, right? I mean, and this is a big one. This is where I see a whole lot of staff, well, I'm busy, I'm overwhelmed. We're all busy, we're all overwhelmed, right? That's our favorite story to tell ourselves. But we use that as an excuse to not actually follow through ourselves. So anything you have in terms of accountability, anything you have in terms of what you want your members to perform like, you have to be willing to do that yourself as well. All right, dynamics. Let's talk about dynamics a little bit. So your first step to creating the proper group dynamics actually begin during your recruitment process, right? So we tend to, just get a butt in the seat. That's one of our volunteer recruitment. I don't know, I just need somebody to be here and do it. And that works against us so much. As I'm sure you've all experienced, sometimes it's easier to not have somebody there versus having the wrong person there. So recruitment is where you're really going to start thinking about your group dynamics and get specific about the people you need. One thing I advise, and again, if you Google this, you'll be able to find it, is to create a matrix of skills and knowledge that you need to meet that committee's objectives. So you'll find a lot of templates for that, specifically designed for boards of directors, but you can actually transfer that over to whatever model you're looking at. So this is where you might say things like, we want gender parity, we want folks from certain income brackets represented. I want somebody who has a legal background. I want somebody, who is coming from a diverse community. So you can kind of etch out exactly what you need. What are the characteristics? What are the backgrounds? What kind of skills do you want your advisory entity to hold? So start with that matrix tool. Once you have that matrix, now you have an opportunity to conduct targeted recruitment, right? So you know exactly who you're looking for. And the more specific we are when we start asking around to get recommendations, the more likely we are to find the people we want. So once you found some folks that meet that matrix for you, the next piece is to give them the position description, right? And this is why we put so much effort into it. So as they're just even considering whether or not they want to join us, and if we're considering whether or not we want them to join us, give them a clear snapshot, right? You're going to be looking at 6 hours a month, roughly. We get together quarterly. 1 day a year, we're going to have this banquet. We're hoping you'll be doing these things in between meetings. So the clearer picture you can give them of what they're signing up for, the better. Then you'll actually go in through and just interview, just like you would anybody else. And the purpose of the interview here is to gauge relevancy, right? Like, does this experience lend? Is this person bringing the lens that's going to help us move this forward? How interested are they? And are they in the position to take on the commitment, right? I've had a lot of fantastic people that I've wanted to bring into advisory capacities with me in the past that I couldn't because they were just too busy, right? And I was like, that's cool. We're going to find another role for you. We'll find a way to bring you into the fold, but this isn't it. The other piece is if it's going well and it seems like they are really relevant and they are willing to take on the position description, this is where you're going to start asking them, what are their personal goals? And this is how you begin thinking again, as a volunteer, what is it that they want to get out of this? And I'm going to start designing that and keeping that in the forefront of my thinking as soon as we begin working together, so that I can make it meaningful for them and keep them motivated. So the first step is recruitment. Next is communication, and you guys hit this one huge, right? And what we're talking about here is really more about sort of group communication strategies and staff communication, not necessarily interpersonal, which are two very separate issues. So here, kind of just some easy tips. Number one, make sure that the communication is accessible. And what I mean by that is if you have an advisory group of senior citizens who are not digital natives, maybe using a Facebook group to communicate with them isn't their best call. If you're working with folks who are in some of our frontier counties or in some of our tribal nations, recognizing there's a digital divide. So depending entirely on online communication mechanisms might not be the right call. So you need to be thinking about your entity and your group and not bringing your assumptions about what's accessible communication to them. Next, communicate consistently, reliably, and cleanly. So consistently, I mentioned if you're the key staff person and you're setting aside time each week, make sure that you're reaching out, that people are hearing from you consistently, that they remember that they're on this advisory committee for you. Reliably means that you're using the same mechanisms and that you're predictable, right? So folks go, well, I know I always hear from Shannon a week before the meeting, or, just be reliable in how you're communicating. And then cleanly, man, that just means like pause, read your work, have somebody else look at it. Don't be that person that's like, whoops, I forgot, whoops, send another thing, whoops, I used the wrong email address for you for the 6th time, even though you've told me 6 times that that's the wrong email address. So just again, this is about being professional and clean and making that communication as easy as possible for your members. I like to utilize email and file sharing when I'm sharing resources. So that's just a tip for me. I like to have a Google Drive set up where people can get their handbooks, their position descriptions, anything we're working on. But I'll also attach that as an email attachment when I'm communicating with folks because I just want them to have as much access as possible. I really suggest utilizing online calendars anytime you're working with a community group. Those can be updated in real time. Everybody's going to a central location, and there's limited room for confusion when we use that strategy. And then this final one, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, right? Everything we've talked about here is sort of an electronic means or, some kind of a virtual means. And sometimes we can get overly reliant upon using those strategies. So don't be afraid to pick up the phone too and call your people. If you're not hearing back, if you're not getting a response, give people a call. But I always say is when you call folks, you always want to follow up via email too. And that's just documentation, making sure that everybody's clear on what the conversation was. So for me, if I'm not hearing from somebody, I'll be like, hey, Jim, Shannon, I've been emailing. I'm sure you're busy. I just wanted to check in. Oh, no problem, Shannon. Sorry, I've been meaning to get back to you. We'll talk about whatever it was that I was trying to get him for. And then I'm going to follow up and say, hey, Jim, thanks for the visit today, just to confirm, right? So you just want to make sure you're doing that little follow-up. Communication. All right. Meetings. It might sound funny to have like meetings on here, but the reality is when you're working with a community group, a lot of the times when you're coming together, you are coming together for meetings. And so it seems, to me, it makes sense that we would talk about a couple of bullets here for effective meetings. So my first tip for you on effective meetings, and like, let's not frustrate people before they get in the door, is to utilize a meeting scheduler, right? So doodle polls are great. I use those all the time. It allows you to put forth a bunch of dates and times, and you just send it out, and people let you know when they're available, and you pick the date where most people are available. It's a lot easier than the like long, 20 reply email chain where you can't keep track of what Sam's doing on Friday and was the 18th good or not. So again, be clean in your communication, use some of those tools. For me personally, when I'm preparing to have a meeting with any group, but an advisory group in particular, I'm going to send them draft agenda and materials 1 week in advance. 1 week in advance, reliably, predictably, I'm going to give them the materials that we're going to use during that meeting, and I'm going to tell them, hey, you've got to the end of the week or 3 days, look this over. What additions, suggestions, questions, is this what you need? Always giving people the opportunity to participate and co-create that meeting with me. Once I've gotten feedback and all of that, I'll turn around the final materials 48 hours in advance. So we complain a lot about folks not coming in prepared and not having looked at that. And so you want to make sure that you're encouraging it and giving them ample opportunity to review the materials before the meeting. Taking meeting minutes can be tough, and what I always tell people is the big thing to be intentional about is like clarifying if a decision has been made and documenting that, and then clarifying any action steps or to-do items that might be coming out during the course of the conversation. So even if I'm, facilitating or participating in the meeting, I personally always make sure that if I hear an action step, if I hear a to-do list item, I'm going to write that down. And then at the end of the meeting, you repeat it back to the group. So I just want to be clear. It sounds like we made this decision. Is that correct? Okay, great. It sounds like we have these 5 things to do. Sam, are you going to do that one? Lisa, you're doing this? Great. So it's just a way to verbally confirm with everybody. Like, we didn't just come here to talk. Like, we actually have to-dos. We're going to carry this conversation forward. So that's the process I like to use. I like to get my meetings out within 72 hours, and I take that to-do list, and I actually will copy and paste that into the body of the email. Right? Because how many of us get meeting minutes and we're like, oh, I got them, and we don't open it up until 30 minutes before the next meeting. So put those to-do lists in the body of the email so people actually have an opportunity to move forward on that, and they'll see that right in front of them. The final piece with meetings is that you have to utilize effective facilitation skills. And again, that's not something that we're going to cover today. I know many of you have gotten training on that already. If you haven't, there's great resources online to help you better understand how to be a strong facilitator. And the idea with facilitation is that, you're leading a process, you're not taking control of the group, and that you're giving them the proper container to upload information, make meaning of that information, and then figure out what to do with it moving forward. So if you haven't spent any time looking at your facilitation skills, I would definitely advise you do it. Okay, last piece for our dynamics is this really kind of this heart part, right? And that's really about member engagement. So we can have great structure, we can have accountability and position descriptions, and we're doing meetings really well, and we did great recruitment. But if we're not actually putting a little heart into the way that we're engaging our members, we're still going to miss the boat. So a couple things that, again, tips for me. Number one, remember that meetings are about them, not you. When you're working with your advisors, when you pull them together, your job is to listen. It is to be curious. It is to answer their questions. It is not your opportunity to present and put yourself in the front of the room. You should always be in the back of the room when you've got these people together. Utilize icebreakers and team building activities. I know there's so many people who roll their eyes at this stuff, but man, it's science, it works, right? Like, this stuff is proven to increase participation, to make people feel more comfortable and vulnerable with each other. And we know that when people are feeling that way, their work improves, both the quality and the quantity. You can do icebreakers super quickly at the beginning of a meeting. You can bring a team builder in and use that as a way to just open up or wrap up a day. And I always tell people, like, what's dumber than doing a dumb icebreaker? Being the person who's too cool to do a dumb icebreaker. So that one's for free. You can use that with your people should they resist you on that. Send regular updates and feel-good stories. Okay, so again, we're talking about communicating regularly and predictably, and don't make it always about business, and don't forget that these folks are volunteers and they want to hear about the good work. They want to hear about little Johnny's scholarship or whatever is your big organization's win for that month. So make sure you're including them on those stories so they feel connected to the output of your work. Invite them to participate in other events and activities. So, invite them to come volunteer, bring them to different banquets. If you're hosting a community forum, invite them. So just make them feel as included as they can, but always make sure they know that those are just requests and it's okay to say no, that you just want them to know they're included. Introduce them to your other stakeholders, right? This is something that I know I've seen advisors frustrate before, where it's like, oh, this big funder was here and I never even introduced you to them. So make sure that they feel powerful. And again, when we're looking at the ladder of participation, wanting our advisors to feel like they're making a difference for our organization, and are playing with the people who are really structuring and driving the organization forward. Send specific, meaningful thank yous. This is huge, right? So the whole at the end of the meeting, thanks for your time, everybody. Really appreciate it. Couldn't do it without you. That is nice. But what's even nicer is a thoughtful handwritten card or a call just to say, hey, I just wanted to let you know I was thinking about it today and I want you to know how much I appreciate you. Again, volunteer strategies, recognition is huge. Individual specific recognition goes a long way. Then there's other people who like that individual specific recognition, but also would take a parade for their efforts as well. So doing public recognition tends to be something that's very motivating for your advisors as well. So don't be afraid to do a little letter to the editor, or maybe do a blog on them on your website or something, just so folks around there know that you've got people behind the scenes. And remember, as you're doing all of this, you're trying to cultivate these guys for additional responsibility. So I always like to say, I want to start with a beneficiary that shows up at a focus group that I can convince to maybe come volunteer. And after they volunteered for a bit, maybe give them an opportunity to start advising. And if I can get them advising really well, could they potentially be my next board member? So just be thinking about that this ladder of participation, that why these people are here to help support and guide our initiative. There really is an opportunity there for us to create some sustainability. So I know there was a lot of information, a little bit of a fire hose. And so as we're wrapping up, I want to hear from you, right? So you guys are the experts, you're out there, you're working as national service members. When you think about the information that we just covered, why is it so important for AmeriCorps members in particular to be working with community advisory groups and doing that work well? So this is your opportunity, if you're still out there listening, to share in the chat. How do we land this? Why is this especially important for national service members to be doing this work well? Whoops, why does it do that? Feel free to chat. Your chat is still there. Because we work directly with the community. Okay, let's keep going. Because we show up and we don't know anything or anybody, because community service is the whole reason we're here. I like that, Richland County, duh, right? You guys get it. Here's the thing. It helps to have help. Every player has something to offer. Yes. What else? Why is it so important for national service members in particular? Directly with the community. We don't know anything or anybody. Community service is the whole reason we're here. Why else? You're working with limited resources and time. Absolutely. The time piece is huge. It goes by fast. It builds capacity. Getting community input is essential to our work and allows the work to be sustained in the community after our term of service is over. Absolutely. Right? That's the thing. When you were brought in as a national service member, generally speaking, nonprofits aren't like, dude, we're killing it. We're overly resourced. We have everything we need. Let's get an AmeriCorps member. No, that's not how that works, right? People are bringing you in because they need that assistance. They need that support, whether direct service or indirect service. And so you coming in short term to do that and making sure that whatever happening is really getting connected with the community is huge. That's the long-term sustainability. Killer, you guys. Well, you've got it. I wanted to leave a couple minutes if we wanted to do any Q&A. So if anybody has a question, maybe just say I have a question in the chat, and then I can call your name and you can actually unmute. You guys want to get crazy and unmute? Use your voices. Anybody who has a question?
I think I can make people, yeah, so we're going to make people panelists, and that should allow them to talk freely. I think you also can raise hands. So either type it in or just click that hand raise thing over there, and we will fire it up.
Any questions out there? A lot of information. Nobody in the chat. No hands being raised. We have a little Q&A box. How do I find a good advisory committee? So Caitlin, are you to serve on, or are you looking for how do you find one for your organization? I would say, just kind of guessing, so if you're looking at one to serve on, I've actually found that the community foundations often are really in touch with where the community advisory committees are. So if you're looking to serve on one, I would say, that got weird for a minute, no worries. I would say that that might be a good starting point, is to look at the community foundations. They tend to have a good pulse on where those are happening. And then for you, creating one, I'll bring you back to that recruitment step. I think that's really, you know, looking at step one and what are the skills and knowledges and abilities that you want for that group. Any other questions from folks? Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, what I would love to do is just ask you guys to just maybe share a key takeaway or something that you got from this session in the chat. So as you reflect over, we covered a lot. So we talked about the purpose of advisory committees, the value they have to our work. We talked about the ladder of participation. We talked about some different models, structural issues, dynamics. So what's your big takeaway? Richland County, yes, groups should be formed with a clear objective. Amen. Start there. What else? What are some other key takeaways that folks got from this morning and or afternoon's webinar series? Groups should be formed with a clear objective. What else? I know you're out there. Assuming you're typing still. Group dynamics are tremendously important. Yes, absolutely. Thoughts on how to have a more engaged group. And that's just the starting point, right? I really would direct folks to the field of volunteer management to understand that. Absolutely, Mandy, the importance of the front end structure to make everything else run more smoothly. And that's not a principle that applies just to advisory groups. I do that with small businesses. I do that with a bunch of different entities. Cool. What else? What else did y'all get? What else is out there? Loudly grateful. Yes, absolutely. They're volunteers. We get frustrated with them, but they're volunteers. Clear purpose. Can't define it, then you don't need it to be. Absolutely. And we should all have some kind of purpose for an advisory group, but you just need to know clearly why you're having one before you jump in. Okay. Anything else? Big takeaways on the day from the people on the planet out there? Okay. Well, should you change your mind or if anything else comes up, you are free to contact me. Josh has my contact information. The name of the company is Verve Exchange, so you can also find me on Facebook and my website and get in touch that way. But appreciate you all taking the time today. Thank you again for your service, and I hope that this has been helpful and meaningful and that you got something out of it. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Shannon. I'm going to put a plug in here too for folks to make sure to do the evaluation that I'll send out a SurveyMonkey link after the webinar today. Take a couple minutes just to give feedback. We share these with the presenter and figure out how we make this a more meaningful learning experience for you, and we use it immediately. So please take some time to do that, and thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.